Tell your queen, this armor cannot be repaired. Ugh, I've never seen metal like this. The royal smiths failed. And if I fail, then the queen stands alone. It's alive. Impossible. It responded to me.
The armor arrived in 14 pieces wrapped in black cloth. Marcus Dale heard the footsteps in the corridor before the door opened. Heavy and deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone who was not in a hurry because they did not need to be. The door opened and a Vora warrior came through it carrying 2 bundles under each arm. He set them on Marcus's workbench without asking where they should go, went back into the corridor, and returned with 2 more. He did this until 14 bundles sat stacked on the bench in a careful column that left Marcus's lamp and his current project accessible but surrounded. Then the warrior positioned himself just inside the door and said, in standard that the translator bead in Marcus's left ear rendered without effort, that the queen required his craft. Marcus had not said anything right away. He stood in the center of his workshop on the lower market tier of Henoth Station and looked at the bundles and then at the warrior and tried to work out whether there was anything he could say that would change anything about this situation. He concluded there was not. He had come to Henoth Station 4 years ago with a journeyman certification from the Fabrication Guild on his home station and a plan that had seemed reasonable at the time. Learn the Vora metalwork techniques, which were in demand throughout the sector and not widely understood by craftspeople who had not grown up around them. Make a stable income doing repair work. Stay out of the way of people who were not relevant to those 2 goals. All 3 had gone more or less as intended. The staying out of the way had been the easiest part, at least for the first 2 years. His workshop sat at the end of a side corridor off the lower market tier, tucked between a ventilation junction and a storage unit that had been empty since before his arrival. The location had been the thing that decided it for him when he was choosing a space. The main tier was loud and crowded in the specific way that market tiers on large stations always were, full of competing sounds and people wanting things from each other. His corridor was not. The ventilation hissed. The drives hummed somewhere deep under the floor. The light came amber through the overhead panels in the mornings because of some quirk of how the panel sat, relative to the main lighting trunk. And he had lived with that amber light long enough that it had become indistinguishable from how mornings felt. He ate at the second commissary on the Western Ring, where the food was hot and reliable and the tables were mostly empty. He went to the market for parts when he needed them. He came back and worked. He slept in the room behind the workshop that had originally store's closet and was now a closet with a cot and a shelf and a lamp he kept at low because he slept better without much light. This was not a complicated life. He had not designed it to be complicated. After the first 2 years, the staying out of everyone's way had become more of an active project rather than a passive one. Because word had gotten around that Marcus Dale at the end of the side corridor could do things with Vora metal that other craftspeople on the station either would not attempt or could not manage. He could not name the exact job where this had started. There had been a set of cabinet hinges for a merchant family, and he had spent 3 days on them because the Keth pattern was incomplete, and he had needed to understand what was supposed to be there before he touched what was. The family had mentioned him to 2 others. Those 2 had eventually connected him to the clan smith of House Vorath, who had brought him a piece that 4 other craftsmen had declined before him. He had spent 9 days on it and done the thing. And the thing had apparently been passed around in conversation. He had not set out to be known. It had simply happened as a consequence of working the way he worked, which was patiently and without taking shortcuts that would save time now and cost more later. He had learned, through one expensive mistake in his first year on the station, that the first solution he reached for was almost never the right one, and that the right one usually showed up after he had stopped forcing things and let the material tell him something. It had not occurred to him that this approach was unusual. He had assumed it was how competent craftspeople worked. Apparently it was not. Now there were 14 bundles on his bench and a warrior in his doorway who showed no signs of going anywhere. He began unwrapping. The breastplate came out of its cloth, and he set it on the clean section of the bench and pulled the lamp closer. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. The damage was the first thing, and it was considerable. The central section had been caved inward by something large and fast. Not a surface deformation, but a structural one. The kind where the metal had been compressed in a way that changed its geometry rather than just its surface. The Keth pattern across the chest. The interlocking geometric design language that Marcus had spent the better part of a year learning to read even partially was split at the center. The two halves of the design, which had clearly been built to meet at a precise point, no longer met there. They stopped short of it and left a gap where something was missing. Two shoulder fittings had sheared clean off. One pauldron was absent entirely. That was the damage. The second thing was the armor itself, and this was harder to put words to. Marcus had worked with Vora metal for 4 years. He had handled clan heirlooms and trade goods and weapons components and ceremonial pieces, and the occasional item brought in because the family's own smiths had reached the edge of their confidence and needed someone who would approach the problem differently. He thought he had built a reasonably complete physical understanding of what Vora metalwork felt like in his hands. This was different. The alloy was nothing he could immediately place, which was notable on its own. He had been working with Vora metals long enough to identify most of them by weight and by the way they held warmth. This one held warmth differently, not like stored ambient heat from the room, but like something generating from inside, faint and steady. The way living things have a temperature independent of their surroundings. The Keth pattern, even broken, was more complex than anything he had tried to read before. He could follow the structural grammar of it, the logic of how shapes nested and referred to each other, and why a given curve appeared where it did rather than somewhere else. The full meaning he could not read. Not this piece. But the grammar alone said something clearly enough. This armor had been made for a specific person, not just in the physical sense, but in the deeper sense. Made by someone who held every inch of the design in mind for every individual choice. Someone who was building something that was meant to say a specific thing about a specific person across every surface of the object. He rewrapped the breastplate carefully and went to the door. "Who does this belong to?" he said. The warrior looked at him the way someone looked at a question they considered already answered. "The queen," he said. "Which queen?" "The queen." Marcus looked at the bundles on the bench. The warrior, apparently deciding once through the minimum was not quite sufficient, said her armor was damaged in the field. "The courtsmiths cannot restore the Keth." The seam at the center of the breastplate. He paused. Something moved in his expression. Not discomfort exactly, but adjacent to it. They told her the pattern would need to be redrawn from new. She refused. Why does she need it restored specifically now? There is a gathering of the 7 clans. 40 days from now. She will stand before them in her ancestral armor, or she will not stand before them. Those are the only 2 options she has made available to herself. Marcus absorbed this for a moment. A ruling Vora queen with a damaged ancestral breastplate and a court full of smiths who had told her the damage was permanent and she had told them to find someone else instead. "She sent it here," he said. "To me. You restored the seal plate of Commander Vorith's house. 2 seasons passed. 4 smiths before you considered it beyond repair." Marcus remembered that job. 3 weeks. Almost no sleep. A night somewhere in the 2nd week where he had sat on the floor of his workshop with the plate in his lap, completely certain he had ruined it, and had looked down to find that his hands, apparently operating without the involvement of his brain, had made exactly the correct moves while he was occupied with despair. He had finished the job in a state of exhausted disbelief and had not told anyone about the floor incident. "That was different," he said. "The queen did not ask for your assessment of the difficulty," the warrior said. "She asked for your work." Marcus stood in the corridor for a moment and looked at the workshop and the amber light and the 14 bundles on the bench and the warrior who was not going to move. He did the math. 14 pieces, 40 days. The seam at the center of the breastplate, which he had not yet fully examined, but which was already clearly the most uncertain part of the work. "I will need access to a reference archive," he said. "The clan records showing the original Keth pattern as it was designed, not just how it appears now. I need to know what I am restoring toward. Not only what I can see, it will be arranged. I need the matching pauldron, the intact one, to use as a template for the missing piece. Without it, I am making assumptions about the proportions. Bundle 9. And I need to see the armor worn. Or at minimum, I need more than measurements." He organized the rest of the thought. "I need to understand how she moves. The specific way she distributes weight when she is active versus when she is standing still. Vora armor is not fitted to a body the way other armor is. It is fitted to how a body moves. If I build the shoulder plates for how she stands in a room, they will shift the moment she is in motion, and the armor will feel wrong to her. The Keth will feel wrong. It will not sit where it belongs." The warrior was quiet for longer than any of the previous pauses had been. "That," he said, "with care. will require a different conversation. His name was Dareth. Marcus learned this over the course of the 2 days, during which the different conversation was apparently being arranged. In the meantime, the reference archive arrived. A sealed data slate with a young Vora scholar named Tevin attached to it. Assigned to sit in the corner of Marcus's workshop and answer questions. Tevin spent the first day watching Marcus work with the expression of someone who had been told a thing that seemed unlikely and was now watching it happen in front of him and still had not entirely made up his mind about it. By the second morning, something in the expression had moved toward something more like careful attention. "You can actually read the Keth," Tevin said. When Marcus was cross-referencing archive images against the pattern sections still visible on the breastplate. Some of it, Marcus said without looking up. The grammar. The structural logic of why each element sits where it does rather than somewhere else. What I cannot always read is the meaning. I know how it fits together. I do not always know what it says. The courtsmiths know the meaning but not the grammar, Tevin said, after a moment. They know what the finished pattern is supposed to look like. They cannot tell you why each line goes the direction it goes. The grammar is what I need to restore it, Marcus said. He looked at the broken seam. The gap where two things had once met or crossed or done something at the center of the breastplate and now did neither. The meaning is hers. I just need to make sure the shape is right so she can carry it. Tevin went quiet in a way that had some weight to it. Marcus filed that away. By the end of the second day, he had built a clear map of the pattern as it was originally designed, the direction of every major element, the depth of every inlay, the points where different parts of the design referred to each other. What he did not yet have was a solution to the breastplate seam, which was the problem he was going to have to sit with longer before he let himself reach for an answer. On the third day, the Queen came. He heard Dareth's voice in the corridor first, the low carrying register of someone making an announcement, and then the workshop door opened and she walked in. He had not meant to build an expectation of what this arrival would look like. He had built one anyway, assembled from the sealed data slates and the warrior in his doorway, and the particular compressed urgency that had surrounded the commission from its first moment. He had been expecting something that felt like weight settling over a room. What he got was a woman in a plain gray travel tunic with no ornamentation at all, walking through his door the way she would walk through any door she had decided to walk through that day. She was tall in the specific way of the Highland Vora clans, which was not the same thing as using tallness as a tool. She simply had it the way she appeared to have everything else, without needing to comment on it. Her skin was deep bronze gray. Her hair was dark, braided close against her head. When she looked at him directly for the first time, her eyes were amber gold, and the workshop lamp caught them in a way his brain registered before he had finished processing anything else about her. She looked at the breastplate on the bench first, then at Marcus. "You are the human," she said. "Marcus Dale," he said. "Yes." She crossed the workshop without pausing to look at his tools or the shelving or anything other than the bench, and stopped in front of the breastplate. She looked at it without touching it. Something in her posture shifted, very slightly, in a way he logged carefully. "The courtsmith said the seam could not be restored," she said. "They may be right," Marcus said. "I have not decided yet." She looked at him. The look was taking information rather than issuing any kind of test. "Tevin tells me you read the grammar of the pattern. Some of it. Can you read this one?" He picked up the breastplate and held it so she could see the broken seam without needing to reach for it. "I can read the structure," he said. He traced the direction of the design lines just above the metal, not touching. The right side was building toward this point at the center. The left side was coming back to meet it. "What I cannot determine from the archive alone is whether the center point was a convergence, both lines arriving at the same destination, or a crossing, where they passed through each other and continued." "A crossing," she said immediately. He looked up. She was looking at the seam with an expression that he could now read with more confidence. Not grief. Exactly. The specific focused attention of someone looking at something they had known their entire life and were now seeing broken. "My mother told me," she said. "The two lines cross at the center because the Keth of our line is built on the principle of Ketha. Two strengths that do not merge but pass through each other and are made greater by the crossing. It has been the defining shape of this line's Keth for 4 generations. Marcus looked at the seam. He thought through the implications. "That changes the repair significantly," he said. "If the two lines were converging, I would fill inward from both sides toward a shared center point. If they are crossing, I have to restore both lines independently through the damaged zone without letting them merge where they should not. They need to cross at depth, both fully visible at the surface, distinct from each other. He was thinking out loud. It is considerably harder. Can you do it? I do not know yet, he said honestly. I would like a few more days with the breastplate before I give you an answer. She nodded once. Something in that nod told him this answer had satisfied her more than a confident yes would have. Dareth said you wanted to see how I move, she said. I need to understand how you carry weight when you are in motion. The shoulder plates, especially. The fit is not just about your dimensions. It is about your posture under load and how your weight distributes differently when you are active versus when you are still. If I build the shoulders for how you stand in a room, they will drift the moment you are doing anything else, and the armor will feel wrong. The keth will feel wrong. It will not sit where it is supposed to sit. She looked at him for a moment. No one has ever needed to understand how I carry weight, she said. There was something nearly dry in the way she said it. The armor will know, he said. That is the entire point of it. She was quiet. Then she walked to the far wall of his workshop, turned, and came back. She was not performing for him. She was moving the way she moved when no one had asked her to move any particular way. He watched the line of her shoulders, the angle of her spine, the forward lean that was not a hunch but a readiness, the kind that came from years of expecting rooms to change without warning and deciding to be ready before they did, the way her weight transferred through her hips, the way her lead foot came down a fraction of a second ahead of her center of mass. He picked up a charcoal stick and made 3 marks on the edge of his reference sketch without looking at the paper. Again, please, he said. She walked. He watched. 2 more marks, a measurement note written in the margin. Once more, he said. But turn at the far end the way you would turn in armor if you needed to change direction in a hurry. Not a careful turn. She stopped and looked at him. I am not asking because I doubt anything you are capable of, he said. Armor built for how you move in ceremony is different armor from armor built for how you move when it matters. You told me you need to stand before the 7 clans in 40 days. You need armor that remembers you. Not armor that decided who you were based on how you stood when someone was watching. There was a pause. Then she went to the far wall and turned the way she would turn in a real fight. It was fast and low and nothing like the deliberate pivot of ceremony. The weight dropped before the direction reversed. The lead shoulder rolled in. The center of mass shifted forward an instant before everything else followed. The whole thing happened in under a second, and Marcus wrote 3 numbers in the margin of his sketch. Thank you, he said. When he looked up, she was watching him with the amber gold eyes, and the assessment in them had changed its quality. Still measuring, but measuring something different from what it had been measuring when she first walked in. You are a strange kind of craftsman, she said. I have been told. She left. Dareth fell into step behind her in the corridor. The door closed, and the workshop went quiet again. Just the ventilation and the drive hum and the amber light from the lamp falling across the 14 pieces, still wrapped in their black cloth. Marcus sat on his stool and looked at the marks he had made in the margins of the sketch. 3 and then 2 and then 3 numbers. And thought about weight and posture. And a woman who moved like she had spent years expecting rooms to change and had learned to be ready for it before it happened. He had a lot of work to do. He turned back to the bench and started. The first 2 weeks were disassembly. And disassembly was harder than it sounded. Vora armor was not designed with repair in mind. It was designed to be made, to be worn, and eventually to be retired with appropriate ceremony when the time came. The joins that held each plate to the ones beside it were not mechanical, not bolted or riveted or hinged in any way that a standard fabrication background would have prepared Marcus to reverse. They were made with a compound the Vora called theft, applied in a specific sequence at a specific angle determined by the logic of the plate's own shape and its relationship to the plates beside it. The compound behaved like a filler when applied, taking whatever shape the join required, and then over time became structurally indistinguishable from the metal around it, which was the point, which was also what made the whole thing extraordinarily difficult to undo without damaging what you were trying to save. The only way to separate the joined pieces cleanly was to understand the original sequence and work backward through it, every step in reverse, in the reverse order, at the correct angle. A single wrong move meant tearing the join rather than releasing it, and a torn join left damage that was not on the list of problems Marcus had agreed to take on. He documented everything, every join, every sequence, every angle. Every choice the original maker had made that he could reconstruct from what was in front of him. He kept a separate log for the Keth grammar, noting which pattern elements crossed from one plate into the next and how the design maintained its continuity across the joins, because he was going to need that information when he put it back together, and the alignment would need to be exact. Tevin watched and sometimes answered questions and sometimes just watched. His expression had moved, over the course of the first week, from cautious attention to something that looked more like genuine engagement. He asked questions occasionally, not the kind that were testing Marcus, but the kind that were trying to understand what Marcus was doing and why. "You work very slowly for someone with a 40-day deadline," Tevin said on the 7th day. "The deadline is for the finished piece," Marcus said, not looking up from the join he was documenting. "The speed in the middle does not matter. The condition of the pieces when I put them back together does." The quartzsmiths damaged 3 pieces during their initial assessment, Tevin said on the 9th day. Marcus set down his tools. He had spoken the words simply and without any particular setup. The way someone stated a fact they had been deciding whether to state and had arrived at a decision. Marcus looked at him across the bench. "Which 3? The left shin plate, the hip section, the inner shoulder ring." Tevin paused. "The damage at the edges of those 3 is not from the battle. It is from the assessment. The joins were handled incorrectly. The theft at those points has been disturbed." Marcus looked at the 3 pieces in question. He had noticed the edge damage on all 3. He had attributed it to secondary impact from whatever had struck the queen in the field. A reasonable assumption given how badly the breastplate had absorbed the primary hit. He reset his understanding now and looked at the pieces with the new information and saw them differently. The damage pattern was wrong for secondary impact. It was consistent on all 3 pieces, with tools applied from the wrong angle to a join that had not been properly understood before the attempt was made. "The court chief smith submitted a report to the queen," Tevin said. "The report stated the additional damage at those joins was from the battle." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Does anyone know you are telling me this?" "No." He picked up his tools. "Add 3 days to my estimate when you report progress. I will need them for those joins. The theft has to be fully cleared and re-prepared before I can work the plates properly." He went back to what he had been doing. "Do not say anything else about it." Tevin returned to his corner. The workshop was quiet. Marcus worked through the rest of that day and most of the night. And when he finally went to the back room to sleep, he lay on the cot for a while looking at the ceiling and thought about the court chief smith and the report and the queen, who had been told the wrong thing about her own armor. He thought about what it meant to be trusted with something and to handle it badly, and then to cover it up rather than account for it. He also thought about the 3 joins and how much work they were going to add, and how he was going to accomplish that within a timeline that had not had the room to spare in the first place. He did the math again. It fit, barely. He would need the 3 days. He went to sleep. On the 14th day, the queen came back. Marcus heard Dareth in the corridor again, the same low register as before, and the door opened. She crossed to the bench the way she always crossed to wherever she was going, directly and without pausing to look at anything that was not her destination. She stopped and looked at the bench. He had the 14 pieces laid out in their documented positions, each one unwrapped and placed in the spatial relationship it held to the others in the complete armor, an exploded map of the whole. Each piece numbered in his notation and cross-referenced in his log. Spread across the bench like this, they looked simultaneously like a great deal and like nothing at all. 14 individual metal plates that no longer held their shape without each other. She looked at them for a long moment without speaking. "The left shin plate," Marcus said. "The hip section. The inner shoulder ring." He said it without preamble and without building toward it, the same way Tevin had said it to him. "The damage at the edges of those 3 pieces is not from your battle. I need you to know that before I restore them." She looked at him. "The joins were handled incorrectly during the initial assessment," he said. "I am going to have to fully clear and re-prepare the theft at those 3 points. The newer compound will look slightly different from the original when I am done, at least for a year or 2. Over time it will match. Anyone who does not know exactly where to look will not find it, but you will be able to find it if you look for it. And I would rather you know why it is there than notice it later without understanding." A silence settled over the workshop. Not the working kind of silence he had grown used to over the past 2 weeks, but something different, something that had more going on inside it. "I know who is responsible," he said. "I am not naming it here. I am telling you it was not the battle, and it was not anything you could have done differently." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, Can you restore them? Yes, it takes more time. I have the time. Then I will restore them, he said, whatever they look like when I am finished. She stood at the bench and looked at the 14 pieces laid out before her. Her hands were clasped behind her, back in the way they were when she was not in motion and had decided simply to be still. He had noticed this about her, the stillness she could produce when she chose it, the kind that did not feel like waiting, but like a deliberate state she had learned to occupy. What does the Keth say to you? She said. Not the full meaning. I know you cannot read all of it. But what do you see when you look at all of it together? Marcus stood beside her and looked at the pieces. The pattern was scattered across 14 separated sections, broken into fragments that each said something on its own and said considerably more when you understood they were all in conversation with each other. I see a pattern that knows it is part of something larger than itself, he said. Each section refers back to the whole, even separated like this. The pieces are in conversation with each other. The shape on this one, he indicated the right vambrace, is answering something that started over here. He indicated the left shoulder plate. The maker was holding the entire design in mind for every single choice. No individual piece was made as if it existed alone. She was very still beside him, the kind of still that meant something was landing somewhere. My grandmother made this armor, she said. He waited. She made it for my mother. She spent 3 years on it. My mother wore it for 30 years and then gave it to me when I was old enough to stand before the clans. She told me the Keth was made the way it was made because of what the Ketha principle meant to her. Not just as a clan value, but as something she had found to be true in the actual experience of living. A pause. She said the design was the most honest thing she had ever made, because she could not hide anything in the Keth. Every choice was a statement, and she had to mean every statement she made. Marcus said nothing. He was listening. I was wearing the armor the day they called me back from the field because my mother was ill. Her voice did not change in its register, but something in it settled. The way a piece of metal settled under the right amount of heat, finding the shape it was going to hold. I left immediately. I traveled faster than was safe. I arrived too late. She had been gone for 2 hours when I came through the door. The workshop was very quiet. I was still wearing the armor. It was the last thing she had touched with her own hands when she was alive. The last thing she had made a deliberate choice about for me. The thing she had decided I was ready to carry. She looked at the breastplate, at the split seam at the center where the 2 lines had once crossed and now did not. I have always felt that should mean something more than it does, that there should be some way to carry it that honors what it is. I have not found one that satisfies me. Marcus looked at the breastplate. He looked at the gap where the 2 lines had been interrupted. He thought about a woman who had spent 30 years wearing something her mother had made for her, and what it would mean to have that thing broken in a way that other people told her could not be undone. I will get it right, he said. It was not a boast and it was not reassurance. It was the quietest kind of statement, the kind that came from somewhere below the place where performance lived. She looked at him sideways. He caught the edge of an expression that he was learning to recognize, the one that appeared when she had been expecting a certain kind of response and received a different one. You are a strange kind of craftsman, she said again. You said that last time. It remains true, she said. She left. Dareth in the corridor, the footsteps going quiet, the door already closed. The workshop did what it always did when she was gone, returned to itself, the hiss and the hum and the amber light. Marcus stood at the bench and looked at the 14 pieces and thought about what it meant to make something that was genuinely meant, where every choice was a statement and you had to mean every statement you made. He thought about the woman who had built this armor for someone she loved over 3 years of deliberate work, and the woman who had worn it for 30 years and then decided someone was ready to carry it, and the woman who had arrived 2 hours late and was still wearing it when she walked through the door. He thought about what it would mean to get it right, not just technically right, not just intact, but genuinely right, the way the maker had meant it to be. He went back to work. The next 5 days were the 3 court-damaged joins, which required him to strip the disturbed theft completely and begin the preparation from the beginning at each point. The theft removal had to be done in extremely fine increments to avoid deepening the existing damage, and the preparation of the base metal before reapplication had to be exact, because any variation in the surface preparation would show in the compound's behavior during curing and affect the final integrity of the join. He worked through it methodically, the way he worked through everything, spending more time understanding each step before he took it than he spent on the step itself. Tevin watched and occasionally handed him things and did not ask unnecessary questions. which Marcus had come to appreciate as one of Tevin's better qualities. The 3 joins look different from the others now, Tevin said, on the 4th day of this work. They will look slightly different when I am done too. For a while, Marcus was working the last of the old compound out of the hip section, joined with a tool he had made himself for this specific purpose. I told her they would. She said to restore them anyway. You told her. It was information she was entitled to have. Tevin was quiet for a moment. The court chief Smith is senior in rank. Considerably senior. I know. You did not seem to hesitate about telling her. Marcus thought about this. He set down the tool and examined the join. It was clean now, ready for preparation. I was not the one who damaged her armor and then submitted an inaccurate report about it, he said. That is someone else's problem to live with. My problem is the 3 joins in the 40 days and getting the keth right. He picked the tool back up. Tell me about the original theft application sequence for this join, he said. The archive shows the exterior but not the approach angle. You have the original manufacture records. Tevin found the relevant section, and they worked. By the 19th day, the 3 joins were fully re-prepared, and the theft had been applied and was in the final stages of curing. Marcus had been checking the color match against the neighboring original joins 3 times a day since the application, watching how the compound shifted tone as it set. It was close. Not identical. Not yet. But close enough that you would have to know where to look. He moved on to the smaller plates, working in order of complexity, leaving the breastplate for when everything else was done. Not because he was avoiding it, because the breastplate needed him to arrive at it having already solved every other problem the armor presented. If there was something he had missed in the pattern, something about the grammar he had not fully understood, he wanted to find it in the outer plates before he was working at the center. It was a way of preparing without calling it preparation. Tevin understood this, or at least stopped asking when Marcus planned to start on the breastplate. He simply watched and kept the archive open to the sections Marcus needed and answered questions when they were asked. The right gauntlet took 2 days. The left took 1, because what he learned on the right carried over. The leg plates were a different alloy from the upper body and had their own behavior. And he spent half a day just working with a small sample he cut from the replacement material before he touched the originals. The pauldron, the rebuilt one, the one he was making to match the missing piece using its intact twin as a template, was the piece he had been most uncertain about and was the piece he spent the most time on, working slowly and checking the match against the original from every angle he could manage. On the 25th day, Tevin said, quietly, from his corner, the rebuilt pauldron looks the same as the original. Marcus held them both in the lamplight and turned them together. It looks the same from where you are sitting, he said. From here I can see about 8 things I want to go back over. He went back over them. By the evening of the 26th day, he had stopped being able to find the things he had gone back over. He set the pauldron down and looked at it for a while and admitted to himself that it was done. He updated his log. He documented the final state of every piece. He had not yet touched the breastplate seam. On the 27th day, he looked at the breastplate for a long time without picking up any tools. He had been thinking about the crossing for 2 weeks. In the small hours of the night and in the space between other steps, letting the problem become familiar before he let himself try to solve it. He had learned not to rush this part. The breastplate seam was the most technically demanding thing he had attempted in 4 years of work, and the worst mistakes he had made in 4 years of work had come from reaching for a solution before he had fully understood the problem. He understood the problem. He had understood it for several days. What he did not yet have was the solution. He set the breastplate back under the lamp. He looked at the 2 lines of the keth that had once crossed at the center and now stopped short of it. He thought about Ketha. 2 strengths that pass through each other and are made greater by the crossing, not merged, not combined, passed through, each remaining fully itself. He looked at the seam and let himself not know the answer yet, and went to the commissary for dinner, and came back and worked on 2 of the smaller remaining plates until the workshop went quiet and the amber light from the lamp was the only light on in the corridor. He went to bed with the breastplate seam still unsolved. This was not a problem. Sometimes the solution arrived while you were sleeping. He had learned not to argue with that. He fell asleep thinking about 2 lines and what it meant for them to cross without becoming the same thing. He started on the breastplate seam on the 28th day. He had been thinking about it for 10 days by then, in the spaces between everything else, letting the problem sit beside him in the workshop the way a difficult conversation sits beside you before you are ready to have it. He had not been avoiding it. He had been waiting to arrive at it properly, carrying everything he had learned about this armor in the previous 4 weeks, understanding its grammar and its alloy and the specific choices its maker had made, so that when he sat down in front of the seam, he was doing so with all of that behind him rather than ahead of him. The central problem was this. The impact that had caved the breastplate inward had happened at precisely the point where the 2 primary Keth lines crossed. This was not accidental. He had come to think. Whatever had struck her had been aimed, and whatever had aimed it had known where it was going. The crossing point was the structural heart of the breastplate, which meant it was both the most important point and the point that had absorbed the most damage. He had already restored the metal shape. That had taken 4 days of careful layered work, rebuilding the central zone of the plate from the inside out. And when he was finished, the surface was flat and consistent with the surrounding profile. That part was done. What was not done was the Keth, and the Keth was the harder problem. The 2 lines needed to cross at the center. They needed to do this visibly, both of them fully present at the surface of the restored plate, and they needed to do this distinctly, without merging. Because a merge would say the wrong thing about what the Ketha principle meant. 2 things that passed through each other and remained themselves. That was the definition. 2 things that merged were not that. They were something else entirely. Technically, what this meant was, he had to inlay both lines through a zone of metal that had been fundamentally disrupted, maintaining their individual trajectories, having them cross at exactly the right point, neither of them losing its depth or its direction in the process. He could not build one line and then the other, because they crossed, which meant he had to hold both in mind simultaneously while working in a material that did not offer the option to go back and adjust. He started on the 28th day and worked through the morning and through the afternoon, and by early evening he knew something was wrong. He could not have said precisely what was wrong. The lines were going where they were supposed to go. The inlay work was technically correct at every individual step, but the crossing, when he arrived at it, did not sit right. He could feel it in the way that was not a feeling he could entirely explain to anyone who had not spent 4 years learning to listen to what metal told you. The crossing sat wrong. He set the breastplate down and stood back from the bench and looked at it. He picked it up again and examined the crossing under the lamp from several angles. Nothing visibly incorrect. The lines were crossing at the right location. The angle was what the archive showed it should be. The depth of the inlay was consistent with the surrounding pattern sections, by every technical measure he had. The work was correct. It still sat wrong. He put the breastplate down and went to the commissary for dinner and came back and sat on his stool and looked at it from across the bench and tried to understand what he was not understanding. On the 29th day, he went back to it and tried again, adjusting his approach at the crossing point, and the same thing happened. Technically correct, sat wrong. He cleared the section and started over. He did not do this with any frustration visible to himself or anyone else. He did it the way he did everything. Documented the problem. Set aside what he had attempted. Began again with a clear surface. Tevin, who had been watching, said nothing. This was the correct response. Marcus noted it. On the 30th day, he stopped partway through an attempt, set the breastplate against the bench wall, and sat down on the floor. Not on the stool, on the floor. He had a stool at the bench and a stool by the reference shelf, and he had never sat on the floor of the workshop before in 4 years of using it. But the floor was the right height for this problem, because the floor was as low as you could go, and sometimes you needed to be that low before something became clear. Tevin had gone home 2 hours ago. The workshop was quiet in the way it was quiet late at night. The ventilations still hissing, the drives still humming, the lamp still burning because he had not thought to turn it down. The rest of the corridor was dark. Marcus sat on the floor and looked at the breastplate, leaning against the bench, and tried to understand why it was still wrong. He had been trying to restore the crossing at the surface. That was the obvious approach. Both lines inlaid from their respective sides, meeting at the center of the restored zone, crossing at the surface of the plate in the way that the original would have crossed. He had been doing this because the surface was where the Keth was visible, where the pattern said what it was supposed to say. The crossing had to be visible. That was not in question. But something about the surface approach was wrong. He could feel that it was wrong without being able to yet say why. And this was the gap he needed to close. He sat on the floor and did not try to force the answer. He had learned not to force answers. He thought about the word Ketha instead. 2 strengths that pass through each other and are made greater by the crossing. He had been thinking about this for weeks now. He thought about it again, more slowly. trying to hear what it was actually saying rather than what he expected it to say. Two strengths that pass through each other, not two things that meet at a point. Two things that pass through each other. Through, the word implied depth. It implied that the event of crossing was not something that happened at a boundary, but something that happened inside. Somewhere that required both things to occupy the same space without becoming the same thing. He sat with this. The two lines do not cross at the surface. The thought arrived without drama. He was not sure where it came from. It had the quality of something that had been forming below his attention for days and had finally risen up to where he could see it. The two lines cross inside the metal, below the surface. The surface shows both lines clearly, both visible, both present, but the crossing itself happens at depth, where neither one loses itself, where they genuinely pass through each other in the three-dimensional sense. I have been trying to do it at the surface. That is why it sits wrong. A surface crossing is a convergence even when it looks like a crossing. A real crossing happens inside. He stood up and went back to the bench. He worked through the night. He was not aware of the time passing in any way he could have reported afterward. He was aware of the breastplate and the lamp and the specific problem he was solving, which had transformed in the last hour from the wrong problem into the right one, and the right one he could solve. The technique was different from anything he had attempted before. He was not simply inlaying two lines that crossed. He was building a three-dimensional crossing, layered at depth, in a zone of metal that had already been restored once. The surface had to show both lines distinctly. The structure beneath the surface had to contain a genuine crossing, both lines present at depth, each one maintaining its trajectory through the zone where they met. The metal would hold all of this or it would not. He had made the restored zone as clean as he knew how to make it. He thought it would hold. He worked. He stopped twice to check the reference archive. Once he set everything down and made a note in his log and then picked everything back up and continued. He did not sit on the floor again. The amber light began coming through the ventilation gap above the bench. Marcus set down his tools and looked at what was in front of him. The breastplate seam was restored. Both lines ran from their respective sides of the breastplate through the central zone without interruption, crossing at a point just below the visible surface, both fully present at the surface, distinct, not merged. The crossing was structural. He pressed lightly at the center point and felt the integrity of it under the pressure. The theft had cured correctly. The grain direction in the rebuilt zone was running exactly as he had planned. He looked at it for a long time. He heard Tevin's footsteps in the corridor about 20 minutes later, and the door opened. And Tevin came in with the particular expression of someone arriving to start a day's work and finding instead that the day had already been started and finished by someone else. He stood in the doorway and looked at the breastplate on the bench and did not speak for a considerable amount of time. "You should sleep," he said finally. "In a minute," Marcus said. "She will want to see this immediately." "Not until the whole piece is done," Marcus said. "The seam does not mean anything on its own. It means something when the armor is complete, when every part is saying what it is supposed to say and the whole thing is in conversation with itself again." Tevin looked at the breastplate for another moment. "You solved the crossing," he said. "I understood what the crossing was," Marcus said. "Then solving it was just work." He went to the back room and slept for 4 hours and came back and began the reassembly. The reassembly was the part Marcus had not told anyone was going to be difficult, because he had not fully known it himself until he was standing inside it. Taking the armor apart had required understanding and patience. Putting it back together required all of that, plus a specific kind of technical precision that the disassembly had not demanded. The theft had to be applied in position, with each piece already in its correct spatial relationship to the pieces beside it. The compound had to cure in exact alignment. Once it began to set, there was no adjustment available. Either the alignment was right or it was wrong, and wrong would mean damage, and damage at this stage, with everything else already done, was not an option he was willing to think about. He needed something that could hold each piece in precise position while the theft cured without his hands. His hands were not precise enough for this. He knew this from the disassembly, from the evidence of how the quartzsmiths had held the pieces during their own preparation work. Two people holding plates by hand during curing could achieve a workable result for standard repairs. For this armor, with this keth, with the pattern lines crossing joints at specific angles that had to align exactly, workable was not good enough. He spent 3 days designing a solution. Not 3 days at the bench, 3 days while doing other things, while finishing the smaller plates, while eating at the commissary, while lying on the cot at night. He worked it out in his head, piece by piece, The way he worked out everything that mattered. When he had the design complete, he built it in 2 days from components he had in the workshop and additional pieces he commissioned from a fabricator on the tier above, describing what he needed without explaining why, which was a skill he had developed over 4 years of working on things that were not his to discuss. The system he built was a series of adjustable braces, each one capable of holding a plate in 3-dimensional position while the theft cured at the join point beside it. The braces could be calibrated to within fractions of a millimeter. They locked independently, so that adjusting one did not shift another. He could set each plate in position, check the Keth alignment against his reference marks, fine-tune the brace, lock it, and move on to the next one. Tevin watched him calibrate the first brace and said, "This is not a standard technique. There is no standard technique for what I am doing," Marcus said. "The standard approach involves 2 people holding the pieces by hand during curing. 2 people by hand cannot achieve the precision I need. 1 millimeter off at a shoulder join translates to how much drift at the arm in full motion. About 15 millimeters if she is turning fast. Enough that she would feel it. Enough that the armor would feel it." Tevin watched him lock the first brace and move to the second. "You invented this for this job," he said, "over the last 3 days." "Yes. That seems like something that should have existed already." "Maybe," Marcus said. He was checking the alignment on the second brace, making a small adjustment, checking it again. "I will think about that when this is done." The reassembly took 6 days. He worked in order, outer edges building inward, the smaller plates first. The major structural plates once the structure around them was established, and the breastplate last. Every morning Dareth appeared in the corridor and Marcus went to the door and said the same thing. Another day or 2. Dareth's expression remained as informative as a closed door. This was fine. Marcus did not need Dareth's expression to be informative. He needed the joints to cure correctly. They did. The Keth alignment, when he checked it against his reference marks after each joint had set, was correct at every point. The pattern lines that crossed from one plate into the next crossed at the right angles. The elements that referred across the joins referred to the right things. The design was in conversation with itself across every piece of the armor. The breastplate he set into position on the 32nd day and let the brace system hold it for the final cure. He did not go to sleep. He sat on his stool and watched the join set, which was not a thing you could watch happening, but which he watched anyway. The way you watched something important, even when there was nothing to see. When the compound had fully cured, he released the braces and checked the join from every angle he could access. He lifted the breastplate and checked the Keth at the seam, unbroken, both lines running through the center of the plate, crossing at depth, each one fully visible, distinct, not merged. The crossing holding exactly as designed. He pressed at the center point and felt the structural integrity of it, which was complete. He set the breastplate down. He stood back from the bench and looked at the armor on its stand. The 32nd day, and the armor was whole. The breastplate set seam was invisible at any distance greater than 30 centimeters. The Keth pattern ran unbroken across every plate. The crossing at the center held exactly as he had built it. The shoulder plates were positioned for the forward angle and the fighting turn and the weight drop before reversal, built from the marks he had made in the margins of his reference sketch on the 3rd day. The rebuilt pauldron sat against its intact twin with no readable difference from any angle he had been able to try. The 3-quart damaged joins looked slightly different at their edges from the surrounding original joins, and he had told her they would, and he had built them as close as he could. The armor was itself. He went into the back room and washed his hands and stood still for a few minutes. He noticed that he had been holding something tense for the better part of 32 days and was now not holding it. And the absence of that tension felt strange in the way that the end of something always felt strange, even when the end was exactly what you had been working toward. He went back out. Tevin was at his corner, looking at the armor on the stand, with an expression that he seemed to be working to keep neutral and not entirely succeeding. "It is done," Marcus said. "Yes," Tevin said. "Tell Dareth she can come when she is ready." Tevin nodded and gathered his things and left. The workshop went quiet. Marcus sat on his stool and looked at the armor on the stand and thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was something he had not been able to do for 32 days. The amber light was coming through the ventilation gap. The drives hummed under the floor. He had work to do on other commissions, the jobs that had been sitting in the queue while this one occupied the bench. He looked at the list and then looked back at the armor and thought he would start on the other jobs tomorrow. Tonight he would sit here and look at the finished thing. He did. She came the next morning. Marcus heard Dareth in the corridor at the same time he heard boots he did not recognize. More than one pair, heavier than Tevin's measured footsteps. He had been at the bench since before the amber light came through the gap, not working on anything specific, cleaning and organizing the tools he had been using for the last 5 weeks with the particular thoroughness that came from needing to do something with his hands while he waited for a thing to happen. The door opened. The queen came through first. Behind her were Dareth and 2 warriors Marcus had not seen before, both in formal house colors rather than the plain practical gear Dareth usually wore, whatever this visit was. It was not the same category as the visits that had come before it. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the armor on its stand. She did not say anything. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long enough moment that Marcus set down what he was doing and simply waited. The 2 warriors behind her had gone still in the way that soldiers went still when they were told by the situation to be still rather than by any specific order. Dareth held his position at the door, with the careful composure of someone who had decided this moment required him to be invisible and was succeeding. Then she walked to the stand. She looked at the breastplate first, the way she had looked at it the first time she came, standing before it without touching it. But this time what was in her posture was different. The first time there had been a careful containment, the practiced composure of someone who had spent years being observed and had built a surface for it. What he was seeing now was not different in any dramatic way. The surface was still there, but something underneath it had shifted its weight. She was standing before something that was itself again, and that was doing something to her that she was not performing for anyone. She reached out and touched the breastplate at the center, at the point where the seam had been. She pressed her fingertips lightly into the surface and moved them slowly along the line where the 2 Keth elements crossed. Feeling the depth of it, both lines present under her fingers. Distinct, the crossing structural and real below the surface she was touching. "You cannot feel the join," she said. "No," Marcus said. "The theft is fully set now. The structural integrity at the center is equal to or greater than the original surrounding material. I rebuilt the metal at that zone from the beginning and was able to optimize the grain direction in a way that the original manufacturer could not have done. Because the original makers were working on a whole suit at once, and I was working on one specific problem with one specific objective." She lowered her hand. She was still looking at the breastplate. "The Keth at the seam," she said. "The crossing holds as designed," he said, "both lines at depth, both fully visible at the surface. Neither merged." She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him directly. And what was in her face in that moment was not the assessment he had grown familiar with, not the measuring quality she brought to most things. It was something simpler than that and harder to look at for exactly that reason. It was just a person standing in front of something that mattered. "Can I put it on?" she said. "That is what it is for," he said. She looked at him and he saw what she was not saying, which was that she did not need the room cleared, that she was accustomed to the presence of witnesses, that the attendants behind her were attendants she trusted. He understood all of this. He also understood that this was not a moment that required witnesses, including him. "I have cloth to organize in the back room," he said. "You do not have to leave," she said. "I know," he said, and went into the back room and closed the door behind him. He stood in the back room for 10 minutes and listened. He had spent 32 days building a mental image of how this armor sounded when it was being assembled correctly. He knew which joins engaged in which order and what each one felt like from the outside when the theft seated properly. He had listened to the armor during the reassembly with the same attention he gave to everything else, because how a thing sounded told you things about whether it was right that how it looked sometimes did not. He listened to the sounds of the armor being donned properly, in the hands of someone who had worn it for years and knew it the way you knew things you had carried for a long time, plate by plate in the right sequence, each joint seating the way it was supposed to seat, and then a silence. And within the silence, something that was not quite a sound, but was the particular quality of a room changing, when the thing in it has found the state it was meant to be in. He counted to 30 and came back out. She was standing in the center of his workshop. The 2 warriors who had been at the back of the room had moved forward. Not consciously, he thought, but in the way that bodies moved when they were pulled by something they were not entirely aware of being pulled by. They had gone still in a way that was different from the still they had been before. This stillness had something in it, something he did not have the Vora language to name but recognized anyway, in the way the hairs on his forearms stood up. Dareth in the doorway had straightened to a posture that was not his usual posture, not attention in the military sense, but something older than that, something that came from before the vocabulary of rank and order. The armor fit the way he had built it to fit, for the forward angle of her posture and the combat turn and the weight drop before reversal. It sat on her the way he had intended it to sit, as though it had always been built around the particular geometry of how she moved and stood and occupied space. The Keth pattern ran unbroken across every piece, from the crossing at the breastplate center out through the shoulders and vambraces and leg plates. Every element in conversation with every other element, saying what it had been designed to say about the person inside it. One of the warriors said something in Vora. His voice was low, careful, the voice of someone saying a thing that was significant and wanted to be accurate. Marcus's translator bead gave him. The Orange Queen stands true. The second warrior said it after a moment. Then Dareth, from the doorway, said it in a voice that carried out into the corridor and came back as a faint echo. Marcus stood at the bench and did not say anything. There was nothing for him to say. The thing being said was not something it was his place to say, and the moment was not one he had any role in beyond the work that had made it possible. She was looking at him. You restored the Ketha, she said. You explained it to me, he said. I followed the logic. The courtsmiths had the same explanation. They were looking at the surface, he said. The crossing happens inside. She looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that he had not seen before in the weeks of this commission. Something that was past the assessment and past the careful containment. Something that was simply present in the way that people were present when they were not working at anything. Name your price, she said. Whatever the standard rate is for a Class 2 restoration, he said. A pause that was longer than the ones that usually preceded her responses. What you did is not a Class 2 restoration. I know, he said. I am charging it anyway. Why? He thought about how to say it. Because I do not want the cost of this to be something you carry, he said. The only thing I wanted to do was get it right. It is right. That should be the end of it. A long silence. She looked at him for a moment more, and then she said something in Vora to Dareth. Something short that Marcus's translator bead did not catch clearly, and turned back. I would like you to come to the gathering of the 7 clans, she said, 8 days from now, as a guest. There will be a formal presentation of the restored armor, and it would be appropriate for the craftsmen to be present. I do not know anything about clan gatherings, Marcus said. You do not need to. You will stand where Dareth tells you to stand and be quiet when it is time to be quiet. Marcus considered this. That I can do, he said. The gathering was held in the Hall of Concordance on the station's upper tier. Marcus had walked past the Hall of Concordance 4 times in the past 4 years, always going somewhere else. Always on the tier above or the corridor adjacent, never with any reason to go in. It was the kind of space that existed for events he was not part of, and it had never occurred to him that this might change. He arrived with Dareth an hour before the gathering was scheduled to begin and spent that hour standing at the left edge of the main floor, against the stone wall, watching the space fill up around him. The hall was larger than he had estimated from the outside, the way certain spaces always were, calibrated to accommodate more than seemed reasonable from the corridors that led to them. The ceiling was vaulted and high and covered in Keth patterns that he could see were extraordinarily complex but could not begin to read from the floor. Narrow windows cut the upper walls at intervals, placed to bring in shafts of cold clear light from outside, and the angles of those shafts moved slowly across the floor as the station's rotation shifted them. 7 delegations occupied the curved stone tiers in formations Marcus could see were meaningful without being able to read the meaning. Hundreds of aura, warriors and elders and scholars and advisors, all of them in the formal colors of their respective clans, all of them knowing exactly where they were supposed to be and what that placement communicated to everyone who was watching. Every one of them Vora, except Marcus Dale, standing against the left wall. Tevin materialized beside him at some point, quietly enough that Marcus noticed him only when he was already there. When she enters, Tevin said, do not speak. Do not nod. Do not move. I was going to not move, Marcus said. Good. How loud is it going to get? That depends on what happens, Tevin said, with a careful absence of inflection that Marcus did not entirely trust. Ceremonial drums had been going since before dawn, working through a sequence of rhythms that had specific meanings Marcus could not access. The rhythm changed. The hall went quiet. She entered from the high north entrance. The hall had been loud before in the specific way large halls full of people were loud. The accumulated sound of hundreds of separate, smaller sounds blending into a kind of sustained presence. And then it was not loud. The quiet happened the way it always happened when a large group of people simultaneously decided to pay attention to one thing. She came in wearing the armor. Marcus had seen the armor on the stand in his workshop, and he had seen her put it on in the particular quality of light his workshop had. The amber from the lamp and the hiss and the close familiar dimensions of his side corridor space. This was different. The Hall of Concordance had those narrow high windows and the cold clear light that came through them at angles. And the armor did something in that light that it had not done in his workshop. Something that was not reflection exactly, but closer to agreement. The metal and the light finding an arrangement with each other that was more than either one produced alone. She walked to the center of the floor the way she always walked, directly and without pausing, and stopped. The keth ran complete across every surface of her, the crossing at the breastplate center holding as designed. And she stood the way she stood when she was simply being herself. Weight forward. The readiness that was not performance but fact. The forward angle he had built the shoulders for. The hall was very quiet. From the upper tiers came a sound that was not yet words. The sound that came before words when a large group of people was seeing something and had not yet decided what to do with what they were seeing. Then it broke into words. An elder from one of the outer tiers stood and said something that Marcus's translator rendered as, "The armor of the orange line. Restored." A voice from a different section. "It cannot be restored. We were told the pattern seam at the center was beyond repair." A third, "Look at it." A pause. The specific quality of silence that happened when a hall full of people was looking at one thing and finding that the thing was different from what they had been told to expect. The first elder again. "Who did this work?" She turned. Slightly. The movement was subtle. A shift of weight and direction. But the hall had been watching her. And the hall's attention followed where she looked. And several hundred Vora found themselves looking at Marcus Dale. Standing against the stone at the left edge of the floor. A human in a work tunic, hands at his sides. In the Hall of Concordance on the day of the 7-clan gathering. He became very aware of himself in a way he was not usually aware of himself, Dareth said, in a carrying voice in standard so Marcus would understand it. The craftsman Marcus Dale, human of the station market tier. Silence, then a voice from the warrior section. Marcus could not see who, could not identify the clan. One voice, pitched slightly too loud for what had apparently been intended as a comment to a neighbor, landing in the quiet of the hall with the specific weight of something that had misjudged the moment. "Marry him." A pause, then a second voice, from a different section. "Marry him." Then a third from the upper tier. And then the rhythm of it caught and spread the way rhythms caught and spread in large spaces when they found their shape. And Marcus stood against the stone wall of the Hall of Concordance and listened to the hall fill with it. "Marry him. Marry him." In Vora and in standard both. The translator bead rendering every iteration faithfully. Warriors thumping fists against chest plates. The percussion that Tevin had once told him was reserved for strong approval at significant moments. Tevin was standing beside Marcus, looking straight ahead with the focused composure of a man fighting for his life against something that was trying to become visible on his face. "Is this?" Marcus started. "Do not speak," Tevin said. His voice had a quality in it that Marcus would examine later. "Marry him. Marry him." She had turned fully to look at him. The composure she brought to everything, the surface she had built over years of being watched, was doing something it clearly did not often do, which was cracking. Not into distress or anger, but into something that was fighting very hard not to be a smile in front of several hundred witnesses. The fight was not going well for the composure. She walked across the floor toward him. The chanting continued, finding its own momentum now, the kind that would not end until something changed. She crossed the floor of the Hall of Concordance in her grandmother's armor and stopped in front of him. The cold light from the high windows caught the keth at the breastplate center. She stood the way she always stood. Weight forward, unhurried, and looked at him from the distance of one arm's length. "I apologize for this," she said, below the sound of the chanting. "Is this normal?" he said, also below it. "No," she said. "This is entirely new. Should someone stop it? The things that stop it are me saying something, you saying something, or both of us leaving the hall." Marcus looked briefly at the ceiling of the Hall of Concordance, which was vaulted and covered in keth patterns he could not read, and then back at her. "What would you say?" he said. She looked at him, the amber gold eyes, the armor catching the light. The thing that had been fighting her composure had won, quietly and thoroughly, and what was on her face was simply someone who was present and had stopped managing it. I would say, she said carefully, that the craftsman has my gratitude and my family's gratitude and my honor, as long as this line stands. And, he said, she was quiet for a moment while the chanting continued behind them, and the percussion of it moved through the floor under their feet. And, she said, that I would like to have dinner with him, on whatever day suits him, in whatever place he prefers, since I am told he prefers places that are quiet and unremarkable and mostly empty. Marcus looked at her. He thought about his workshop and the 32 days and the floor at 2 in the morning and the crossing that happened at depth where neither thing lost itself. He thought about the second commissary on the western ring with its ordinary yellow light and its mostly empty tables. Thursday, he said. The second commissary on the western ring. Tables in the back are quiet. She looked at him. The food, hot and unremarkable, he said, but the tables are mostly empty. Something crossed her face that was not the smile exactly, but was very close to it. I find I am less concerned about the food, she said, than about the company. Dareth cleared his throat. In the Hall of Concordance, with its vaulted ceiling and its several hundred people, the sound had considerable reach. The chanting slowed and lost its rhythm and dissolved into something that was laughter. The particular laughter of a large group of people recognizing simultaneously that they had all done the same undignified thing and could not manage to fully regret it. The elder who had first spoken stood and said something that the translator rendered as, "The orange line stands. The gathering may proceed." And it proceeded. 8 days later, Marcus arrived at the second commissary on the western ring at the time he always arrived, which was earlier than strictly necessary because he had not been able to sit still in the workshop and had eventually decided to simply go. He sat at the table in the back. He waited. He was, for reasons he chose not to examine closely, not entirely capable of sitting still here either. She came without Dareth. She sat down across from him, and the light in the commissary was ordinary yellow, and the food that arrived was hot and completely unremarkable. And they ate and talked. She asked about the brace system he had built for the reassembly, and he explained it, and she asked 3 precise follow-up questions in a row that told him she had understood the core of it better in 5 minutes than most people would in an hour. He asked about the gathering, not the ceremony but the politics of it, and she told him without the diplomatic framing she probably used with advisors, which parts had proceeded as planned and which had not, and which had departed from any plan by a sufficient margin to constitute their own category entirely. The chanting, she said. Yes, he said. It was not, she said, the most significant breach of ceremonial protocol I have witnessed in that hall. In the 14th year of my mother's rule, a warrior from the Eastern delegation challenged the seating arrangement with sufficient volume that 2 elders left the hall, and 1 threw a ceremonial object at the presiding elder. Marcus looked at her. That is genuinely reassuring, he said, but it was close, she said, and the smile that had been fighting for ground since the hall arrived in the commissary's ordinary light, completely and at full strength, and it was the face of someone who had forgotten for a moment to be watched, and who was not minding the forgetting. He looked at her across the table. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Why me? There are Vora masters elsewhere on this station and on stations throughout the sector. Why a human on the market tier? She considered it for a moment in the way she considered things, not stalling but actually thinking. Vorith's seal plate, she said. I saw it after you restored it. I knew that piece. I knew what it had looked like before the damage. After you finished, it did not look repaired. It looked as though the damage had simply never occurred, as though the plate had always been exactly that way. That is the goal, Marcus said. A good restoration does not announce itself. It makes the repair belong. Yes, she said. Exactly that. I did not want the armor repaired. I wanted it to be itself again. He thought about the breastplate seam, about the floor at 2 in the morning, about understanding that the crossing happened inside. It is itself again, he said. I know, she said. I felt it when I put it on. The commissary hummed its quiet hum. The dishes were cleared. More tea arrived. He had not noticed ordering it. She looked around the commissary. The ordinary yellow light and the mostly empty tables and the hum of the ventilation that was in the same frequency as his workshop because it was the same station and the same system running through the walls. 4 years, she said, looking around. This is where you eat. Most days, he said. Alone. Usually, he said. She looked at him across the table. The assessing look had not gone away. It was simply assessing something different now. Something it had decided was worth the attention. I would like to come back, she said, on whatever day suits you. Thursdays are good. he said. "I do not have anything on Thursdays." She nodded. "Thursday," she said. Outside the commissary, the station went about its ordinary business, and the light was ordinary, and the ventilation moved its ordinary air. And Marcus walked back toward the market tier, through corridors he had walked 400 times before. And the workshop was where it always was, and the amber light would be amber in the morning, and the bench was clean and waiting. He went in and sat on his stool and looked at the empty stand where the armor had been, and thought about two lines crossing at depth where neither one lost itself. He had come to Henath Station with a plan. The plan had been straightforward, and he had executed it. And somewhere inside the executing of it, without designing for this outcome, he had built something, a set of skills and a reputation and a body of knowledge. And that thing had crossed paths with something much larger than him, and neither had been diminished by the crossing. He had Thursdays now. He had the amber light in the mornings and the work on the bench and the ventilation hiss and the drives under the floor. All of the things he had come here with. And now he had something else, too. Something he had not planned for, and which fit alongside everything else the way things fit when they belonged. He went to bed that night and slept without any difficulty at all, which had not been true at any point in the previous 32 days. And in the morning the amber light came through the ventilation gap, and he got up and went back to work. The Friday after the first Thursday. Marcus spent most of the morning failing to work. He had jobs on the bench that needed doing. A shoulder plate from a Vora merchant family that had come in 2 weeks ago and been waiting politely ever since. A set of decorative panels for a clan house on the mid-tier, with a straightforward repair to 3 Keth elements that should have taken him an afternoon. He sat at the bench and picked up tools and set them down and picked up different tools and set those down too. He looked at his reference sketch from 5 weeks ago, the one with the charcoal marks in the margins. 3 marks and then 2 and then 3 numbers. Made while she walked across his workshop. He had not removed it from the wall above the bench when the job was done. He had not thought about removing it. He looked at the marks now and thought about the way she had moved across the floor without performing anything, simply moving, and what it had told him about how to build the shoulders. She moved like she knew what she was for, he thought. Then he thought about what a strange thing that was to think about a person, and also that it was exactly accurate. And then he went back to looking at the merchant family's shoulder plate without picking up any tools. He had not understood 4 years ago what a solitary life actually was. He had thought he understood it. He had chosen the work, and the work had come with the quiet as part of the arrangement. And he had been content with the arrangement in the way that you were content with things that fit the shape of who you were. The work was enough. The work was the kind of thing that felt like enough. He had eaten at the commissary alone and solved hard problems alone and slept in the closet room behind the workshop alone and had not been unhappy about any of it. But he understood now that there was a difference between a solitary life that was the right shape for you and a solitary life that was simply the shape you had settled into without examining whether there were other shapes available. He had not been unhappy. He had also not known what he was missing, which was a different thing from not missing it. He picked up the tool for the merchant family's shoulder plate and got to work. He thought about Thursday the entire time. The second Thursday. He turned the corner from the western approach, and she was already at the commissary door. They arrived at exactly the same moment, which produced the brief particular awkwardness of 2 people who had each expected to arrive to find the other waiting, arriving instead to find each other in the process of arriving. He stopped. She stopped. A half-second of recalibration. "I could have been late," he said. "I was early," she said, deliberately. "No," she said, with a precision that suggested otherwise. They went in and sat at the table in the back. She had apparently been briefed on the menu at some point, because she ordered without looking at it and without the pause of someone working through unfamiliar options. She ordered the same thing he ordered, which he noticed and chose not to mention. "Tevin tells me you have been getting inquiries," she said. 3 this week. Marcus said one of the elders from the Eastern delegation had come to the workshop in person. 2 others had sent through Dareth. "What did you tell them?" she said. "I told them I had a waiting list and they could add their names to it." She looked at him over her tea. "Do you have a waiting list?" "I do now," he said. "I made one this week." The not-quite smile was present, the one that lived just below the surface of her expressions and came out when she was not managing herself for an audience. "You should raise your rates," she said. "I charged you class 2. He said. "Yes," she said. "That was not a sustainable business decision." "Maybe not," he said. "It was the right one for that job." She looked at him across the table. The ordinary yellow light. The unremarkable food. The hum of the commissary doing what commissaries did. "I have been trying to understand you," she said. She said it the way she said most things. Directly and without the cushioning most people used when they were about to say something they were not sure was safe to say. 15 years of ruling, and everyone who comes to me or to someone near me wants something. Sometimes the thing they want is good, sometimes it is not, but there is always a want. You charged me class 2 for a month of work that. She stopped, reconsidered. You want the work to be right. That is what you want. Yes, he said. He thought about it. The work being right is not a small want, he said. It has taken me 4 years to learn how to want it properly, to understand what properly actually means for this kind of work. What right looks like when you are working in a language that is not originally yours and on objects that belong to someone else's history. She was quiet. My grandmother's armor is right, she said. I have worn other armor during the years this was being restored or assessed. None of it has ever felt the way this one feels. It feels like it knows where it is. Because it does, he said. The Keth knows. That is the point of the Keth. It is not decoration. It is the record of every deliberate choice the maker made about who this object is for, built into the structure of the object itself. And the object carries that record whether you can read it or not. Can you teach that? She said. The grammar. What you understand of it. What I know is grammar without full meaning, he said. You would need a scholar for the meaning. I know why each line goes where it goes. I do not always know what the line says about the person it was made for. I have scholars, she said. Tevin has been learning from watching you. He retains more than he realizes. He retains everything, Marcus said. He just does not always know what he has done with it yet. She looked at something past his left shoulder, a short private moment of thought. Then she looked back. I would like to bring him. If you are willing to teach, formally, with the archive, what you know of the grammar. I can teach what I know, Marcus said. She nodded once. Then I will arrange it. He looked at her across the table and decided to ask the question he had been turning over since the hall. The Ketha, he said, the principle your grandmother built into the armor, does it apply only to materials, in the philosophy? Or did she mean it more broadly than that? She applied it to everything, she said. She said the principle was true at every scale. 2 materials, 2 people, 2 ways of understanding the same problem, 2 lines of work that cross when the work is right. She said the principle held at every scale she had tested it against, which, by the end of her life, was most of the scales available to a person. He thought about the breastplate seam, the floor at 2 in the morning, 2 lines that crossed at depth and were each fully present and fully distinct on the surface above. That is a hard thing to maintain, he said, not losing yourself in a crossing. Yes, she said, it is. She looked at him. But the armor holds. She looked at him with something that was the assessment and past the careful surface and was simply her, sitting at a table in an ordinary place eating unremarkable food, which he had come to understand was something she did not get to do very often, or perhaps had never done quite like this. With the right craftsman, even after damage, the armor holds. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at the table, and then back up at her. Thursday next week, he said. Thursday next week, she agreed. The days between that Thursday and the next one were different from any days Marcus had spent on Henneth Station before them. Not dramatically different. He still went to the bench in the mornings. He still ate at the commissary. He still worked through the evenings and went to the closet room and slept. The external shape of his life was the same shape it had been for 4 years, but the inside of it had changed in a way he was only beginning to locate. He taught 2 sessions with Tevin in the archive, working through the structural grammar of the Keth in a more organized way than any of the conversation they had had during the commission. Tevin was a fast learner with the particular quality of someone who had been storing observations without a framework for them and was now finding the framework arriving. Everything clicking into place in a way that had clearly been waiting to happen. By the end of the 2nd session, Tevin was reading structural elements independently and asking questions Marcus had not been able to formulate for himself until his 3rd year. He took on the merchant family shoulder plate and finished it in 2 days, which was faster than he expected, and not because he was rushing, but because he had spent the last 5 weeks working at the highest difficulty he had ever attempted, and the shoulder plate, which had seemed like a reasonable job before the commission arrived, now presented itself as a set of problems he had already solved more complicated versions of. He finished it and looked at it and thought, this is good work. He had not thought that about a completed piece in some time. He had been too close to things to think it clearly. He started a waiting list. He was methodical about it. He thought about the brace system he had built for the reassembly, the adjustable positioning rig that had let him hold every plate in exact calibrated position during curing without needing to use his hands. He had built it for one job and it had worked. He thought about whether it was something that belonged in permanent form in his workshop, a tool rather than a specific solution. He thought it was. He spent 2 evenings rebuilding it properly, in better materials, with better calibration tolerances. A tool he would use again rather than a thing he had made once under pressure to solve one immediate problem. Tevin, when he saw it, said, "You are making it permanent. Yes, it should exist." Tevin said, "I know," Marcus said. "I told myself I would think about it after." This is after. On the 3rd Thursday, she was waiting at the commissary door again. And this time, neither of them said anything about it. And they went in and sat at the back table, and the food arrived, and the tea arrived, and they talked. She told him about the Eastern elder who had come to speak with her formally about the Keth restoration and what it represented for the gathering's proceedings. She told him without diplomatic framing, the actual content of what was said and what it meant, in the tone she had used from the 2nd Thursday onward. The tone was not performing anything. He told her about the brace system becoming a permanent tool. She asked 3 questions. They were exactly the right 3 questions. He answered them, and she understood the answers, and asked a 4th question that was better than the first 3, and he answered that too. And they sat there in the commissary's ordinary yellow light, talking about calibration tolerances and structural grammar, and the Eastern elder's political position, and how the gathering had shifted the alignment of 2 clans who had been in a cold disagreement for several years. And the food was hot and unremarkable, and the tables around them were mostly empty, and the commissary hummed. He walked back to the workshop afterward through the same corridors he had walked 400 times. And the workshop was where it always was, and the bench was clean, and the stand was empty, and the amber light would be amber in the morning. He sat on his stool and looked at the tools hung in their places and thought about a plan. 4 years ago he had come to Henneth Station with a plan. The plan had been 3 things: learn the craft, make a living, stay out of everyone's way. He had done all 3. The learning had been harder than expected and deeper than he had thought learning could go, had become less like acquiring techniques and more like learning a language, and then less like a language and more like learning a way of seeing. The living had sorted itself out, gradually and then all at once. The staying out of the way had worked for 2 years and then had not worked, and in the not working had produced something he had not planned for. He thought about the armor, about a pattern that knew it was part of something larger than itself, even when it was separated into 14 pieces on a bench. About 2 lines that crossed at depth and were made more fully themselves by the crossing rather than less. About his grandmother, the Queen's grandmother, who had built that principle into every surface of the object, because after a long life of testing it against everything she could find to test it against, it was the truest thing she knew. He had come here with a plan. The plan had been a good plan for what he knew at the time. It had taken him to the workshop at the end of the side corridor and the amber light in the mornings, and 4 years of learning a language he had not known was also a way of seeing, and a reputation he had not sought, and the specific slow patience that came from learning not to rush toward answers before the problem had fully shown itself. It had taken him to 14 pieces in black cloth and a breastplate seam no one else would try, and the floor at 2 in the morning and the understanding that the crossing happened inside, at depth, where neither thing lost itself and both things were changed. It had taken him to Thursdays. He had the work and the bench, and the amber light and the drives under the floor. He had Thursdays. He had a waiting list and a rebuilt brace system, and a scholar who was learning the grammar from the beginning. He had something to look forward to in a way he had not had something to look forward to for 4 years, and the something was not dramatic or large. It was simply the right scale. A table in the back of a commissary and tea and a conversation that went where it went without either of them deciding where it should go. He did not know what this was going to become. He understood, at least, that it was something. He understood that the crossing had happened, not at the surface, not in the dramatic visible moment of the hall or the chanting or the armor catching the light, but somewhere deeper and quieter and more structural, in the weeks before any of that, in the work itself, in the problem sat with until it showed its real shape. He thought this was probably the way most things that mattered actually happened, not in the moment everyone was watching, but in the accumulated weight of all the moments no one was watching. The decisions made alone in amber light at a bench at the end of a side corridor. The hours spent on problems that did not announce themselves as important while you were inside them. He picked up his tools. He had work to do, and Thursdays and the amber light in the mornings. And now, alongside all of those things, there was something else. Something that had arrived without being invited and had turned out to fit. The way things fit when they belong. When the crossing is right, and neither thing loses itself, and both things are made greater. It was not his original plan. It was better than his original plan. He went back to work.